I was going to tell a story, but it's so consistent with what all three of them have said. The most common way of responding to a negative comment is to go back, look at what you've written, and say, how could those reviewers be so dumb as to misunderstand what I meant? Oh, I said that. I can fix that. I can make it clearer. I can include a definition of environmental management. And when I do, I'm going to write back to the editors and say, here's how I responded to these questions, to these comments by doing this and this and this. What does that do? That makes it easy for the editors to understand that you have responded intelligently to the reviewer's comments and made it better. That makes it easier for them to say, yes, publish this article. And that's what you want. But by making it better, you make it better, so it should be published as well. Those things are all coming to the same end. Any other questions, comments?
Yes, sorry that I
No. Ask
no problem.
Thank you.
We like it.
Thank you. Again, going back to your answer about 45% rejection rate, which I think is very high, but I still salute the way that you keep the standard of rejection high by,
Thank you.
by getting this more rejection. But okay, now within this 45% rejection, there are certain 50% or whatever, but there are obviously certain papers, as you rightly pointed out, not directly dealing with impact assessment. So you can leave aside them. That's okay.
Yes.
Leave them aside. Say 25%. Balance papers, they are discussing about impact assessment story, but there may be some problems here and there. But as a professional, I would feel rather uncomfortable that they cannot be accommodated in the journal. But would you consider another way of publishing this kind of material? Because fair enough, I mean, there's so much of good work that has been going in, but the fact that maybe the consultant did not have enough time to do some references, etc., some methodological, the key point that you listed. So I think it is fair enough if you can consider making another avenue to publish this kind of paper.
Oh, we do.
Not the rice production paper. Thank you.
No, I'd like to respond, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you. That's an important question, and there's an important response.
Very important response. Thank you. It's a great question. A couple of things. The percentage rate of rejections includes the papers that were abandoned. Now, we have each year, I shouldn't say this because we don't like this, but last year we did have, I think, about four or five papers that we had gone through a review process, and the reviewers were supportive. Please, yes, this paper should be published subject to these changes. Given back to the author. Author said, yes, I'll make the changes. Follow up after 2 months, how are you going with the changes? Follow up after 4 months, how are you going with the changes? Follow up after 6 months. And eventually we draw the line and say, well, finish, and we abandon it. And sometimes we hear nothing. We've heard initially, and then they never, with the follow-up, they never respond. And there comes a point when we abandon them, where there are abandoned papers. So they feature as rejected, right? Probably the most common change that occurs to a paper that we receive is a conversion from a prof practice to a main paper, or a conversion from a main paper to a professional practice. Sometimes people send us a paper that's 3,000 to 4,000 words long, and it's on a fantastic subject. And it's just, there's rich data there, and there's amazing things. We write back to them and say, look, we want you to expand this. We'd like to expand this part of your method, this part of the literature review, this part of your results. And they do. And we actually increase that paper. But that's probably about 20 to 30% of the ones that change in that way. More commonly, we get a paper which is long, it might be 6,000 or 7,000, 8,000 words, and it's kind of losing focus somewhere along the line. And we say to them, we think there's something to publish here for our impact assessment audience. And we write back and say, like, drop that section. That section on agricultural techniques doesn't do it. This section on the impacts of those agricultural techniques on the community, that's really interesting. So can you convert it from a full paper down to a professional practice paper. And that's really common. If you look in the last couple of years, you'll see there's lots of shorter papers in IAPA. We've actually up to more papers per edition than was previously the case, because we've ended up publishing more authors with fewer words, and I think that's a better outcome. So that's a long answer to your question. The short answer is we do try. If we cannot possibly accommodate the paper in IAPA, we suggest alternative journals. But agriculture in India, I can't suggest an alternative journal, but we do try where we can, and we've been successful many times in suggesting an alternative.
As a reviewer from time to time, I think one of the questions is, if this manuscript doesn't fit into our journal, can you suggest others that it does fit?
That's one of the criteria.
And that's one thing that the reviewers can do if they know the material.
Thank you very much, sir. My name is Silas Adega. I work with Petroleum Ministry in Nigeria. From your last comment concerning some of the papers that will not be published in an IAPA journal, is it possible for us to have two sets of papers? You have A and B. Because somebody sending a paper to IAPA journal, he has a lot of confidence that at least I have a message from a co-professionals. Now, if we can adopt the situation whereby, I'm just suggesting, we can have more than one issue. Maybe we have IAPA A, IAPA B, so that some of the papers that cannot fit into A can go into B. I don't know if it's possible. Thank you.
I'm glad that you asked that question just as the chair of our editorial board came into the room.
Thank you for the question. I actually think that has been a discussion over the years with IAPA. Basically, we've got an A, B, and a C. The A would be a paper in IAPA, the B would be a paper in the conference proceedings, I would say, and C would be something in the newsletter, possibly. So those are options if you want to publish. Unfortunately, I think IAPA is not flexible in terms of adapting to quality, in terms of rigor and the fact that it is an academic journal. So it's difficult to make that distinction between an A and a B. So we prefer just to be the A. And so that's the end of story.
Any other questions or comments or threatening words to the editors or things of that sort?
I'd like to know about the language editing part that you were talking about. Do you expect that the authors would actually do the language editing from their part and sense?
An excellent question. Thank you.
That's a very good question. It's a question I face as an academic when I have international students, and I work at an English-speaking university, and we give a degree for a university that speaks in English, and it's always this issue of how much language, how much do we expect English expression to be perfect, and how much not. The difficulty we have is really in a way is with our reviewers. I gave you the story of when I used the seemingly innocent term environmental management and a reviewer didn't understand what I meant because I had a particular context that I was using it in, and he didn't understand that. When English is anything less than grammatically perfect, you're in for complete misinterpretation and misunderstanding of content. Now, if we have really clearly very, very poor English papers submitted to us, we do not send them out to review. If we cannot understand the paper, if we can't make sense of like the opening paragraph, if we can't work out whether they mean this or that because it's broken English, we just send it back and say, look, you need to get an English person to help you. We can't do it. We've got too much traffic, and there's no one else who can do it. So it really is the author's responsibility. If the English is a bit dodgy, is a little bit, it's a little bit wrong, we don't mind. And we sometimes will flag this when we write to a reviewer. We actually might say, dear reviewer, etc., etc. We say, look, we note that the English expression in this manuscript is not perfect. However, we believe the quality is sufficient for you to understand the meaning. In other words, we tell the reviewer, and the reviewer doesn't have to accept our request to review, but we are flagging with the reviewer that we know English is an issue, so don't get a bee in your bonnet about that, and try and work with it. IAIA, I was on the board of IAIA, and when I was on the board member a few years ago, this issue came up. How can we help? Because we're an international association, we've got members from 110 countries, but our journal's published in English. So how can we help people from a non-English speaking background to publish in our journal? And we've never got very far with a solution. The best thing you can do is to partner someone as a co-author, a young American graduate student who wants to get publications and make them the second or third author, but the deal is that they sort out your English. That's about the only thing I've ever been able to think of as a possible way forward. Unless you have a colleague, an English-speaking colleague in your department or business. But yeah, young academics want publications. They're hungry for them. So that might be an answer.
The other, just changing my hat for a minute, thinking from the IAA point of view, IAA has a mentor scheme, so it's all described in the conference proceedings in the book here. So our mentoring scheme is an opportunity for people to match up with somebody who would agree to help them in various ways. And the mentor scheme is not necessarily meant to be about writing papers, but there's no reason why that couldn't be part of the process. So in your case in particular, I'd encourage you to join the mentor scheme and be assigned with someone to mentor you. But it is something that is very much of concern to IAA, and we struggle with this issue a lot. So be mindful that we are thinking about it. But it's very important that the journal maintains its standards.
Just a quick comment from my side, as wearing my hat as an author, is that I've actually, over the years, found that there's also an advantage to actually write in your second language, because you have to think very carefully what you want to say and how you're going to write that. So I would venture to say that second language speakers sometimes do think better about what they actually want to say, but I might be totally wrong. So it's not all bad.
I think you're right.
Further to that, English is not just one language. English is actually many languages, and those of us who are English speakers, we grow up in particular cultural contexts, we're very prone to using culturally specific expressions. You've probably heard Angus use a few of them already, and I'm sure I use some as well. And with Francois' point that actually when English is your second language, you're less likely to use those culturally specific terminology. Now, for us Australians, because we use colloquialisms or culturally specific expressions a lot, we fall in the habit of thinking that that's actually part of the normal language, but it isn't. So when you write papers for an international audience, it's really important that those culturally specific expressions are not in there. So actually, people whose English is a second language potentially have an added advantage because they're less likely to have those culturally specific expressions